Now, what I want to try to do is to bring together the concepts and ideas from Jung's model that I've talked about so far and to give you an example on how you can apply these things to understand a case of schizophrenia. So I'm going to use a personal example to show how someone using Jung's model would analyze the symptoms and material present during an episode of psychosis in an individual with the schizophrenia syndrome. And the case I'm going to talk about is of a woman I met a couple years ago who gave me permission to make copies of her artwork she made while she was hospitalized. I've removed any identifying information and left out some details to keep things as general as possible, just enough detail I can use to illustrate the main points of Jung's approach. So I'm going to describe how someone may develop a working conceptualization of the symptoms she was experiencing and then examine the meaning behind the images in her artwork to show that there is incredible depth behind these experiences and they aren't simply nonsensical and random and meaningless. So to give you a background, this is a middle-aged woman. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia for at least a decade when I met her. She was on medications for a decade. She was on disability for her diagnosis. So she was fairly functionally impaired. She was living with an ex-boyfriend at the time. She didn't have any family or friends that she was close to or was supportive. So she really lacked a strong support system. She was pretty isolated, which is why she was living with her ex. She did have some children, but didn't have a close relationship with them. She has a long history of trauma and abuse, specifically sexual trauma and abuse from a young person as well as an adult. She was picked up and brought to the hospital because she was very paranoid and having delusions of persecution. She thought that the mayor of her town, the police, and her ex she was living with were in a cult together and were going to sacrifice her. She was so scared that she was outside the apartment in her truck for over 2 days because she was terrified of getting out and going inside. Once she got to the hospital, she started hearing and communicating with her deceased father and with God. They would give her messages and images that she would draw. So in total, she drew 8 pictures. 2 of them you see here on the screen. She would also sign her name using a specific word that meant God in her native tongue, which was a Native American word. So she was simultaneously separate from and in relationship and communicating with God, and she was also identified with God. So to start with the analysis of her symptoms, one thing we can assume is that in her life, she must have felt very stuck and trapped. She had nowhere else to go. She had no other support. She had little income. She was isolated. The control she felt over her situation and life was probably very limited. And because of this restriction in her independence and her capacity to adapt to life, to enter into a phase of life where she was a functioning, independent adult, to take necessary developmental steps of maturation in her personality, we can conclude that prior to these symptoms, she was probably experiencing a block to her psychic progression. So if we remember what psychic progression is, it is when your psychic energy is focused on meeting the demands and responsibilities of the external world of functioning in daily life and society. And whenever this stagnates or becomes blocked, it triggers psychic regression, which is when your psychic energy becomes focused internally, flows into the unconscious, stimulates unconscious material, archetypal material, complexes, and these things, in the case of psychosis, then bubble up and manifest in the form of the psychotic symptoms. So in regards to persecutory delusions, which she was having, these are common archetypal themes that manifest around complexes of the individual. So typically the figures of persecution will be someone close to the individual, like family, or a figure with authority and power, or an entity with the power to oppress people, like the CIA or FBI, which are modern cultural symbols for this. Her delusion around the involvement of the mayor and police and this cult pursuing her could represent the influence of an authority complex. The delusion of the involvement of her ex that she was living with could represent a complex around her animus or masculine archetype. And these attitudes could be representative of past experiences of being abused by authority and masculine figures. So because of the emotional intensity of these traumas and the energetic strength of the complex around it, the complex becomes an autonomous force that is projected out and experienced in the world in the form of the delusional material of being stalked and persecuted. It is the emotional experience or energies of her past memories that have taken a current form. So we can also interpret the voices of her deceased father and God as complexes attempting to reintegrate into her personality once she was in a place she felt more safe and stable. So once she got to the hospital and she was more removed from the threat of the perpetrators, the persecutors that she thought were after her. So these voices were voices of comfort and reassurance that she was lacking in reality because of her isolation and lack of support. There was a redemptive and healing quality and attempt to these voices. They could be seen as the psyche's way of attempting to reorganize her personality around healthier relationships with these specific archetypes and complexes. So her maladaptive or neurotic complexes with authority and the masculine were supplanted by more adaptive complexes, so she was not as bothered by her symptoms. The figures of her father and God were superordinate and ultimate authority and masculine figures that outranked the previous relationships in their position and influence. Also, the relationship she was having with these voices of her father and God would have held together her personality and provided a sense of self-worth and significance, a compensation or coping mechanism for a previous attitude of inferiority. So the signing of her name in her native tongue, using the native word for God, this identification, this could be seen as an attempted merger with the archetype of the self, the inner God image, the experience of completeness or wholeness which brings healing. There is also a psychic inflation to this as the ego becomes over-identified with or possessed by an archetypal force from the unconscious, which can bring a grandiose element often seen in psychotic states. But this is the psyche trying to bring balance here. There was also a type of trinity that was formed with her father, and God, three different identities merged into one. So the Trinity or Trinity figures, this is another archetypal symbol that denotes psychological development. So her Trinity could be a union between the archetypal masculine authority and father energies, which thus far in her life have caused her conflict. Thus, her Trinity may be the psyche's attempt at resolving this conflict. And in Jung's observation, trinities developed into quaternities. And a quaternity is a symbol of wholeness, individuation, and the self. So again, signifying a process of psychological development that was attempting to occur. Now I'm going to focus on the two images, the pictures that she drew that I have here on the screen and the images in them. So if we start on the left, we see that at the top, she labels this as a lake of fire, and she has a volcano that's erupting. And then on the left, she has red birds flying around. And then on the right, you see there is the image of an all-seeing eye. So if we start with the volcano and what this symbol means archetypically and psychologically, I'm going to read a quote. So volcanoes appear in our myths, movies, and dreams. Their awesome destructive power fascinates us and serves as a reminder that we are not in control of nature's primordial forces, offering access to the Earth's molten core. Volcanoes have been believed to be the entryway to the underworld or hell. Volcanoes create new rocks and new landmass. Their mineral-rich output fertilizes the surrounding soil, producing abundant and delicious crops. The volcano serves as a potent image of the unconscious, unpredictable, sometimes explosive, powered from the depths, but also capable of bestowing its fructifying blessing upon us. So the volcano is a symbol of the eruption of her unconscious that she is experiencing. And while it destroys original psychic landscape, or attempts to, this destruction brings a fertilization that allows new aspects of the personality to grow out of it. So if we move over to the all-seeing eye, this is also an archetypal symbol, and this represents a higher power or divine presence that watches over and judges the actions of humanity, an omniscient presence or intelligence that provides order. It could symbolically be a representation of the inner intelligence of the psyche, the self, the central archetype of order and meaning, which is attempting to reorganize the personality to bring renewed order to her psychic experience. So remember that Jung viewed the archetypal self as the central manager in the personality. So in the words of Lionel Corbett, the self is an invisible presence that arranges the different aspects of the personality as if in the form of a drama in which each part plays a role. So we can see how these symbols appearing from the unconscious are related to the psychic process she is in and that she is experiencing on a psychic level. The archetype of the self, the conductor of the psyche, represented by the eye, is overseeing an attempted renewal of the personality, where the old ways of being must be cleared away to make way for the new. And this is what Jung thought the process of psychosis was getting at. So if we move over to the picture on the right, we see figures that she called an army of the dead. And then she wrote Battle of Armageddon and labeled all these different countries that were engaged in this battle. And then at the top, she wrote Al-Malhama Al-Kubra, which I probably pronounced wrong, but this is the Battle of Armageddon in the Islamic tradition. So we can see that there is a big theme of the apocalypse. It's very apocalyptic material that she is depicting in these pictures. So starting with the figures or the army of the dead, these are symbolic images of the forces of the collective unconscious, the objective psyche, which are coming to the surface. So the material that comes forth, the archetypal images in psychosis, come from the collective unconscious, the realms of the archetypes. And this is able to occur because ego strength is reduced in the individual, because psychic progression has stopped. The individual has a weak sense of self. They're unable to cope and deal with their circumstances and with life stressors. And this facilitates the ability of the unconscious bubble up into the awareness of the individual. And in psychosis, to come out in the form of these symptoms. So images of the dead have always symbolized the experience of this unconscious realm. The deepest layer of the psyche is represented by the non-living because it is occupied by ancestral relics of the past, inherited forms of psychic experience handed down in the human psyche from antiquity. These forms, these energies, the archetypes are living skeletons in the underworld of the psyche that will always be a part of the psychic constitution of our being. When these unconscious forces overwhelm our conscious experience, such as in psychosis, it is as if an undead army has breached the gates of consciousness. The depiction of armies may also represent the inner conflict that is taking place between unconscious and conscious forces in the psyche. So talking about the overall theme of the apocalypse, this is another archetypal theme that is present in a lot of psychotic material. And if we look at the meaning of the Greek root of the word apocalypse, it means a revealing and uncovering, to take away the covering of something hidden. So in psychological terms, this could mean to strip away false coverings of the ego to reveal painful wisdom of the self. And the four elements of the apocalypse are revelation, judgment, destruction, and renewal. And these are the experiences, the processes going on within the psyche of the individual. The depiction of this theme reflects what is happening internally. To an individual, the archetype of apocalypse represents a process of initiation where the ego is confronted by the self of the objective psyche because its typical way of being in the world and doing things has become too limited and must change. So it is trying to initiate change, to update, to upgrade, to develop the personality. So I'm going to read one last quote. This comes from the JungianCenter.org, further talking about the archetype of the apocalypse. So whenever we experience the archetype of the apocalypse, we are being asked to recognize our limitations, see our mistakes, feel the pangs of conscience, and come to sense the need to find more authentic and meaningful ways of being. Our world and worldview are shattered, and that is precisely what the self intends. Only by losing our old world and ways of living can we experience the reconstitution or renewal that is at the heart of the archetype of the apocalypse. The self is ever making all things new. It seeks a renewal. It enters consciousness, the world of the ego's making, and shatters its conventions and images decisively so as to permit a new inner reality more appropriate to our soul and the spiritual growth that we have achieved. So this apocalyptic material is symbolizing the need of this patient's psyche to change and update. And thus far in her life, there has been a failure to be able to mature and adapt. And the psyche is attempting to initiate this change on its own terms through psychosis. So I also want to again mention, in case you forgot, that archetypal material is filtered through cultural symbols to make itself known. So remember that archetypes are unknowable in their pure form because they are systems of energy. So they manifest in forms that are relatable on an emotional level. So the fact that she used specific names of countries and al-Malhama, al-Kubra, it doesn't mean that these things are to be taken literally. These are symbolic expressions that are relatable to her psyche, to her consciousness, and thus these are the avenues this archetypal energy that is expressing itself chose in order to create some sort of resonance within her. So I know that was kind of long, but I hope that made some sense, or at least shows you that there is a lot of rich meaning in the material of someone who is going through schizophrenia and psychosis.